All right, that's what that was. All right, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to week 2 of our course, Early History of the African Renaissance, African World History from 1896 to the present. Just like last week, it's the same type of format. We're here at BIA Media, and we are broadcasting both live via Zoom, also on, is it BIA Media's social media pages and YouTube, and this meeting is also being recorded. So as always, with our sessions, we will have our lecture for about an hour, 15 minutes. I'll stop in the middle for a recorded Q&A. And then I'll continue to lecture some more. Then I'll turn the recording off and we'll have open discussion. But as always, or now we'll go until about 12:30, no later than 12:35, so that we can respect the time. So if you have a question or comment that you don't want to be recorded, save it until that section. I'll make sure we have enough time to address those things. Last week, we started the class talking about Ethiopianism, and we talked about religious movements that emerged on the African continent in the late 19th, early 20th century. And we talked a little bit about Pan-Africanism and some of the personalities that we mentioned today. We briefly introduced them last week. We looked at Charlotte Mukeke from South Africa. We looked at the Ethiopianist movements in South Africa, the role of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in bringing Africans from around the world together to fight against the onslaught of colonialism, to fight against Jim Crow racism, to fight against all forms of exploitation and oppression of Black folks during that time. So we kind of went from last week in terms of time period, 1896 to about the 1920s, 19 teens. We're going to the period that we're going to talk about today, and our main focus, because remember this session, we're looking at meetings and movements. So the movement we're looking at today is the Garvey movement, as well as the Pan-African movement. So they're intertwined, and we're going to talk about that. And then the main meeting that that's going to be our focal point, is the Unia Convention of 1920, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, Marcus Garvey's organization's large convention that went from August 1st to August 3rd, 1920. So that'll be the focal point of our conversation today. And we'll get there. And we'll talk about how we got to this meeting, what influenced this meeting, and what the after effects of this meeting were for the African world. So we'll start our discussion today by talking about what Pan-Africanism is. And then we'll get into how the Garvey movement contributed to not only Pan-Africanism, but also to the African Renaissance. So that'll be our discussion for today. So make sure you're taking notes. As always, remember we have a course website where you can find the readings, the recordings of these lectures, as well as our previous sessions, our previous courses. Because a lot of what we talk about connects to things that we've discussed in the past. All of this history is connected. So the best way to get the most out of these sessions is not just to listen to me on the Saturdays, but also to go and look at the readings and even discover readings of your own. All right, so first things first. Off the screen for some reason. All right, key term number 2. Last week, our first key term was Ethiopianism, and we defined it. Key term for this week is Pan-Africanism, and this definition is a good one. And depending on who you talk to, you might find Pan-Africanism expressed different ways. For followers of the ideas of Kwame Nkrumah, Pan-Africanism is not an ideology, it's an objective. But for our purposes today, we're going to look at Pan-Africanism as an ideology and an organizing principle. We'll talk about Pan-Africanism as an objective in a few weeks when we get to Nkrumah's time. But the African Union in 2013, to celebrate the 50-year existence of the OAU, which became the African Union, they produced a document and they defined Pan-Africanism because it's one of the key ideologies that brought the OAU into fruition. And the African Union defined Pan-Africanism as an ideology and movement that encouraged the solidarity of Africans worldwide. So not just in Africa, but worldwide. It's based on the belief that unity is vital to economic, social, and political progress, and aims to unify and uplift people of African descent. Now, there's a little bit more to this paragraph, but this is the main idea of what Pan-Africanism is. It's about unity. It's about solidarity. It's about Africans working together wherever they find themselves in the world for development. So understand that term. That's what we're going to be talking about today. And no movement quite encapsulates Pan-Africanism as the Garvey movement, even though at the time there was a parallel development called Pan-African Congresses, and we'll talk about those differences between the Garvey movement and the Pan-African Congress movement. But they weren't really they weren't foundational differences of degrees. And matter of fact, by the time we get to 1945, both of those streams come together at the 5th Pan-African Congress, but we're not there yet. So the originator of this idea, one of the probably the principal progenitor of the idea of Pan-Africanism, is this man here. The Trinidadian, well, actually he was born in Barbados, but his family moved to Trinidad when he was really young. So folks in Barbados can claim him, but he's usually mostly associated with Trinidad, is Henry Sylvester Williams, born in 1869, passed in 1911. He's considered one of the founding fathers of Pan-Africanism, and he's the organizer of the first Pan-African Conference in 1900. He's a world traveler. He was a lawyer for the Canadians here. He studied at Halifax, got his law degree. Not really connected to what we're talking about today, but he was also one of the co-founders of the Colored Hockey League in Nova Scotia in the late 19th century. They wouldn't let us play hockey, so instead of complaining and crying about it, we just started our own hockey league and did some innovations, like created the slap shot. It's a good documentary called Black Ice that talks about that. But anyway, Henry Sylvester Williams, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about him today. What he's responding to, what his desire was to create not only a meeting, but also an institution to bring African people together at a time where colonization was at its height. We're talking about the late 1800s, the early 20th century. This is the world that he's looking at, and we've looked at this map multiple times. So if we were looking in the West, we would see Jim Crow racism. We would see in both Canada and the US, we'd see colonization in the Caribbean. We'd see racial discrimination against Afro-Brazilians, Afro-Venezuelans, Afro-Colombians, Afro-Paraguayans. I bet you didn't know there are Africans in Paraguay, but there are. So in the West, you would see that. And then on the continent, with the exception of Ethiopia, which we talked about last week, everything is under colonial control. Now, although we're going to spend a lot of time talking about folks like Henry Sylvester Williams that lived outside of the continent, the Africans that lived outside of the continent, we don't want that to cloud the fact that, just like we talked about last week, whenever there was colonial imposition, there was resistance. So around the time of the first Pan-African Conference in 1900, we have the resistance of Ya Santiwa in what was then the Gold Coast. This was the fight that she led to protect the Golden Stool, the symbol of the Ashanti Empire and Confederacy. She protected that Golden Stool from the British and fought hard and shamed the men that wouldn't fight as hard as she. We talked about Ya Santiwa in our Shiro's class, so make sure you look at it. So anywhere on this African continent, she wasn't the only one. And we talked last week about various fighters against colonization. But sometimes it took leaving the area of struggle to get to other spaces, whether it's the West or whether it's London, that weren't free, because I mean, they're not, Black people, folks are still facing discrimination, but it allowed you to zoom out a little bit, to see the continent as a whole, to see the African world as a whole, and more importantly, to make those connections, that networking that was going to bring Africans all struggling against various forms of oppression together. At this time, there wasn't a place that was more of a example of colonial atrocities, about complete degradation of African life, than in the Belgian Congo. In 1884, 1885, at the conference in Berlin, this territory was given as the personal property of King Leopold II of Belgium. And he finagled the other European powers, and in fact the world, by saying that He wanted to control this area, which was, if we look at it, this is Belgium, what you see in the light green. This is the size of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. You can see how much of a difference in terms of land. It covers almost all of Western Europe. This was King Leopold's personal property, at least in his mind and in the minds of the other European powers. The reason why he was given this territory is because the other European powers, France, England, Belgium, France, England, Portugal, Germany, they didn't want to fight each other over this. So King Leopold said, I'll let this be a free area for free trade. So all the European powers, and even the United States, anybody else that wants to come and invest in the Congo, you can do that. Also, I'm going to make a humanitarian space out of it. This is what King Leopold told the world. This is going to be a place where we end the slave trade in Africa, because there was still slavery going on. Arab slavers were using Africa as a place to send Africans to the Arab world, the Ottoman Empire and Iran and places like that, Gulf states. So he said, we're going to end the slave trade. So, noble principles, supposedly. But what he really wanted was the hyper-exploitation of African people. You can read about it in this book, King Leopold's Ghost. And we talked a little bit about the Congo last week. First, the European powers were in the Congo looking for ivory, for piano keys and pool balls and all that type of thing, and other trinkets. And this kind of, all led to the endangerment of the African elephants, African rhinos that we're still dealing with today. So there's an environmental aspect to this as well. But also the hyper-exploitation of African people. Because unlike the other colonies in Africa that were administered by the British or the French or the Germans, that at least tried to show that they were about this quote unquote civilizing mission by creating hospitals and schools and different things, the Belgians did none of that. It was company rule in the Congo, meaning the Africans were essentially controlled by these companies that came to exploit them, exploit their labor, exploit the resources, because after ivory, then rubber became the main valuable resource of the Congo. Rubber, this is the time of the Industrial Revolution, so they need rubber for bikes and car tires and all this. So it's all coming from the Congo. So you had these companies hyper-exploiting African labor, cutting off people's arms and noses, anybody that resists, that wouldn't go get the rubber for these companies. And just the most brutal atrocities that you could think of were all happening in the Congo. Now, because King Leopold had done this fantastic PR program of what the Congo was supposed to be, few people knew what was going on actually on the ground. That was until 2 African American missionaries that went to the Congo, because for African Americans, they heard what Leopold said. Now, this is the 1880s, the 1890s. What has happened? African Americans are about a generation out of enslavement. Slavery ends in 1865. Many of these men and women were either born into slavery very young, or their parents definitely were. So when they hear about a European king using an area of Africa to end the slave trade, they say, we want to help. We want to help develop this place. We want to go and lend our talents to help end slavery in Africa, because we still see Africans as our brothers and sisters. So George Washington Williams and William Shepard were 2 African Americans that went to the Congo, thinking that they were going to help with this humanitarian mission. But when they get to the Congo, they see the reality. They see the people with their hands amputated. They see the people that have the lashes on their back from getting whipped with whips made out of hippo hide, one of the strongest skins, leathers that you could have. And imagine, you can imagine that rips up somebody's flesh. They see this and they report on it, because they're like, we came thinking we're here for the humanitarian mission, and we're seeing this hyper exploitation of our people. And we're going to tell the world what's really going on in the Congo. It started by George Washington Williams, and then it was picked up by William Shepard. And then white missionaries started to write about it. And once the white missionaries started to write about it, then it started to get really international attention. But it was started by the African Americans that were the first to expose what was going on in the Congo to the world. And all this is going on. And let me continue to reiterate this. The people in the Congo were resisting from the beginning. They were resisting. They were running away from the Belgians. They were fighting the Belgians. They just didn't have the technological advantage. And of course, the Belgians used what the other colonial powers used: divide and rule, different things like that, paying off people, putting Africans against each other. But at no point did the Congolese ever just give in to this colonial domination. So they weren't waiting for a savior, but it does help to have allies that have these international networks. And again, both of these men were also connected with the AME Church. So that's also, again, another major institution in the African world that we always need to discuss. Another interesting thing about William Shepard. William Shepard was also a graduate of Hampton University in Virginia. I keep bringing up these historically Black colleges because of the role that they play in African world history. We talked about it last week, the role played by Wilberforce University and then Lincoln University. We talked about last week. Well, William Shepard went to Hampton Institute in Virginia. Hampton Institute was set up to educate Africans being free from enslavement, as well as indigenous Americans. There was a large group of students that were Native Americans. One of his instructors at Hampton Institute was a man by the name of Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was William Shepard's instructor at Hampton Institute. We're going to go back to Booker T. So while all this stuff is going on in the Congo, Henry Sylvester Williams decides we need to have a meeting of African people to discuss all the things that happen to us all around the world. For the first time ever, we all need to come together as African people and people of African descent to figure out what we're going to do. So he's in London. So after he graduated from the university in Halifax, got his law degree, became a lawyer. He moves to London. He's practicing law. He's hooking up with Africans and folks from the Caribbean that are in London for various reasons, and he wants to convene this meeting. One of the people he also hooks up with as he's traveling around Europe is a guy named Benito Sylvan from Haiti. He was a Haitian diplomat who had traveled not to Europe first, but to Ethiopia. Remember how important we talked last week about Ethiopia's victory over the Italians in 1896. He's in Haiti. In the 19th century, the 1800s, Haiti was that example. When Haiti beat the French and ended slavery and became the only country in the world to go from slavery to independence without any step in between. The enslaved people overthrew their colonizers, their enslavers, and then declared independence and was a symbol for African people that were still enslaved most parts of the Americas at that time in 1804 when Haiti gets independence. So Haiti was that symbol. By the time we get to the end of the 19th century, Ethiopia is now that symbol. Benito Sylvan sees this and he decides to leave Haiti to go to Ethiopia. And he offered his services to Emperor Menelik, and he becomes an aide to Emperor Menelik in 1897. So the year after the Battle of Ottawa, he's in Ethiopia. Well, after making his contacts in Ethiopia and becoming an aide to the emperor, he goes to Europe. And then he connects with Henry Sylvester Williams, and he convinces Williams to not just, because at first Williams was just going to bring together the Caribbean Africans living in London. But he said, no, you need to open this up to all African people, as many African people as you can. And so you got a Trinidadian listening to a Haitian about opening it up to all African, a Haitian representing the Ethiopian government. It's amazing how these people travel. And he actually wrote about the conference. And he said the conference was astonishing for many, disturbing for some, the colonizer, and of overwhelming importance to us. He also wrote a book, and my French isn't good, but des Indigenes, des las colonies, des exploitation. He talks about colonial exploitation. And he talks about the need for Black folks to get together and how colonization is stunting the growth of Black people. It's a very important text. He writes in 1901. The other person that Henry Sylvester Williams goes to promote this upcoming conference and his association that he's creating called the Pan-African Association, which he started in 1897, was Booker T. Washington. So let me go back a little bit. I mentioned him just now. I said he was William Shepard's teacher at Hampton University. But let me talk about him. Because at this time, in 1900, with the exception of Emperor Menelik II This is the most well-known black person in the world. He was the Obama of his time. He was the most, I won't compare him to Obama because Obama was the president of the United States. This man was the president of black people, essentially. This man was the man. If you wanted anything done in black America between the years 1896 and 1915 when he passed away, you had to go see Booker T. Washington. Born in slavery in Virginia in 1856. So he knew slavery, grew up in it. Once freedom is over and he grows up, he gets educated at Hampton Institute. From Hampton, he learns the ideas of industrial education. And he is committed to building the race. This is what he always says. And he writes a speech called How to Build a Race. And for Booker T. Washington, you built a race from the bottom up. Black people need to learn how to farm. Black people need to learn the mechanical arts. We need to know contracting. We need to know brick making. We need to know all these things because these are the fundamental building blocks of a race. How do you build a nation is really what he was saying. In fact, Booker T. Washington writes, while he was at Hampton, one of his dreams was actually to go to Africa. He wanted to go to Africa, but he didn't get the opportunity while he was at Hampton. And then he gets the other opportunity to build an institution in Alabama based off the Hampton model of his mentor at Hampton named Samuel Armstrong. He had this industrial educational model. So he gets the task of building a university, an institute called Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, the Deep South. So he goes from Virginia to Alabama to build this institution from the ground up. He appeals to whites in the South, to whites in the North. And he's so good because he understands the psychology of whiteness. He understands what white people want to hear. So in 1895, at this big convention, the Atlanta Cotton Convention of 1895, he gives this speech. And this is one of the greatest speeches in African world history because what he basically says is, black people and white people can be as separate as the 5 fingers on the hand. We don't need to interact with you socially and politically. We need to connect economically, meaning let black people do what black people have been doing since enslavement. We farm, we can take care of rebuilding the South after Reconstruction, but we're not asking you to sit next to you at the movie theaters or anything like that. White people love this, particularly in the South. They're like, this is exactly what we want to hear. Give this man as much money as we can. The Northerners loved it too, because they're just as racist as Southerners. They don't want black people around either. So they say, give this man as much money as you can. Carnegie's of the world, Andrew Carnegie's of the world, all these people are just giving him money, and he builds this institute. Now, for some of his black critics, like William Monroe Trotter in Boston, and eventually W.E.B. Du Bois, who we'll talk about, they looked at Washington's model as selling out. They said, Washington is saying we shouldn't be fighting for our political rights, and he's selling our people out, and it's not right what he's doing. But Washington was shrewd. He would make these public statements, but in private, he would be advocating for the rights of black folks and using that money, funneling that money that he was getting from the white philanthropy into creating institutions that were going to ultimately fight for the rights of black folks. So this is important. The older I get, the more I appreciate Booker T. Washington, because he built this, and Tuskegee Institute would be that instrument to bring about economic and political development for black folks. He just wasn't open with it because he knew he couldn't be. He was in the deep South of Alabama. They were lynching people for less. Had he been so militant in his speaking and what he was doing, he never would have been able to create Tuskegee Institute to educate thousands of black folks in what was actually needed to build nations. He would argue with Du Bois. He would say, look, yeah, it's fine to learn the classics and get a university education, but if no one's going to hire you because you're black, what's the point? Our people can't hire you. We don't have the money. We need to build from the bottom up. Our people are already good at farming. Let's get land. Our people are already good at building. Let's build. Let's be brick makers. Let's do all these things to build our nation from the ground up. So all that to say, because of this and because of the power of his Tuskegee machine, he becomes incredibly important and well known globally, because what he does with Tuskegee, instead of his dream of going to Africa, he decides he's going to make Tuskegee a place where Africans from around the world can come and study and learn these techniques so that they can go back home, whether it's the Caribbean. He had Haitian students, he had Jamaican students, he had students coming from the continent. We already talked about South African students came to Tuskegee. Students from Ghana, students from Sierra Leone, Liberia came, studied at Tuskegee. Nigeria, they came, studied at Tuskegee, and then they took those skills home. And we're not just talking about farming and other things. It eventually transformed into mechanics. It transformed into all types of sciences that were used. In fact, today, Tuskegee is still one of the top producers of Black scientists in the world. Black engineers, Black veterinarians, Black all types of dentists are still being produced by Tuskegee University. He meets Henry Sylvester Williams in London, and he hears about this Pan-African Association, and Sylvester Williams writes him because he knows if you want to do anything in the African world, if you're not corresponding with Emperor Menelik II, you better be corresponding with Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington loved the idea, and this was a letter, and this is published on our course website, from Sylvester Williams to Booker T. Washington about his African Association. He said, I take it that you are alive to the necessity of a general union amongst the children and descendants of Ham, as it would tend to create a respect for us, which is today non-existent. This, the African Association will endeavor to make representations in cases of oppression affecting our people wherever found. Hoping to hear from you and any other who may be interested. I remain truly yours, Henry Sylvester Williams. Booker T. Washington took him up on his offer. He didn't join the African Association, but he supported it. And then when he heard about the conference, Booker T. Washington took the next step. And he used his power as being the most popular Black person in America, and he promoted the 1900 Pan-African Conference all throughout the Black newspapers, the Baltimore Afro-American, the Pittsburgh Courier, all these Black newspapers. He wrote, if you can make it to London in 1900, attend this conference. He didn't go, but he advised everybody else to make their way there. He also learned about what was going on in the Congo from his old student, William Shepard. When he heard about the Congo and he thought about his own experience as an enslaved person when he was born into slavery, spent his young time into slavery, he became committed to help fighting for the Congo. This isn't brought up when people talk about Booker T. Washington. It's usually a dichotomy. People say, I'm either Team Du Bois or I'm Team Booker T. Washington. People don't realize this man was slick. He would say these things to white folks, but then he would do in the background support all of these political movements. He was the vice president of the Congo Reform Association, an international non-governmental organization that was designed to bring justice to the Congo. After all the atrocities came out and people started to attack King Leopold, people like Mark Twain, the American author, Jane Addams, others, he was a vice president of that association. He wrote about the Congo. Again, when people talk about Booker T. Washington, they don't talk about this part of his activism. He wrote an essay called Cruelty in the Congo Country. And I like how he starts this off. I just want to read this. He says, my interest in the race to which I belong and in the advancement of the cause of humanity, regardless of race, is my excuse for discussing a subject which I have not hitherto called attention to in public print. The oppression of the colored race in any part of the world means, sooner or later, the oppression of the same race elsewhere. Not only this, but what is equally important and equally true is the fact that the degradation and weakening of the oppressors always follows any wrong done to a defenseless people. I love this. He's expressing that Pan-African sentiment. Sooner or later, the oppression of the same race elsewhere. The oppression of the colored race in one part of the world means sooner or later the oppression of the race elsewhere. This is why this man, based in Alabama, is writing about what's going on in the Congo. In another speech that he gave in Boston at the it's a peace conference in 1904. He gives a speech to a largely white audience, but again, he's talking about the Congo, and he's advocating with this organization because he has the ear of very powerful white folks, people like the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, again, Andrew Carnegie, John Henry Clark, the great African historian, tells a tale, not a tale, but what the relationship between Carnegie and Booker T. Washington. Carnegie is one of the most richest men in America. He was a steel, magnet, and he took millions of dollars and put it in the bank. And he told Booker T. Washington, every year you can take the interest of this money. However much interest this money accumulates over the year, you can go to the bank and take it out. This is the relationship that they had. So we had the air of very powerful white people. So this is what he writes. This is what he says in this speech. Villages today are burned. People are murdered or maimed. And the person that transcribed this got Shepard's name wrong. He's talking about William Shepard, his student. He said, Dr. Shepard tells me that which his own eyes, in one village, he saw 81 human hands, which had been severed from the body and were hung up and dried to be presented to the Belgian authorities as evidence that the soldiers had performed their duty. All of this is taking place for what purpose? In order that a few may be enriched at the expense of the many in that far-off country. Civilization should see to it that a change takes place. My friends, Europe should set a better example to my people in Africa. And I love how he says, my people. Booker T. Washington is not separating the African in the United States from the African in the Caribbean, from the African on the continent. So he was committed to fighting for the Congo. Just as committed as Booker T, although a critic of Booker T, was Du Bois, who actually did attend the 1900 Pan-African Conference. Du Bois is a little bit different, though. Du Bois was not enslaved. He was born after slavery ended. He was born in 1868. He was born in the North, in New England. He was educated at Fisk University because he couldn't go to Harvard at the time, which was a historically black college in Tennessee. Graduates from there, then eventually does go to Harvard as the first black person to get a PhD from Harvard. Then he also does some work at the universities in Germany, and then comes back to the United States, what he calls nigger hating America. That's what Du Bois called the U.S. after he lived in Europe for a while, to teach at Wilberforce. And this is when he becomes the teacher of Charlotte McKay. We talked about that last week. But he was critical of Washington, but not about Washington's African work. So Du Bois, like many who had heard Washington talk about this conference that was coming up, attended the conference. And at the conference with Williams, once it actually happened, representatives came from the U.S., Antigua, Jamaica, Trinidad, St. Lucia, Cuba, the Gold Coast, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire. Just some of the African attendees. Now, one thing about these Pan-African conferences and congresses that are going to occur in the early part of the 20th century, they get more and more continental African as the years go on. But they start off being dominated by folks from the diaspora. So representing Africa, you had Benito Sylvan, who was from Haiti, but he was representing Ethiopia. You had F.S.R. Johnson from Liberia. You had G.W. Duff from Sierra Leone. You had A.F. Ribeiro from the Gold Coast. And this is just the write-up of Benito Sylvan wrote up about the conference in this magazine, The African Star. This is just a letter from Benito Sylvan to Du Bois. Again, all these people are in conversation. A lot of this stuff is on our course website, so you can look at it. The attendees from Europe, you had attendees from the Caribbean, again, St. Kitts, Trinidad, Dominica, so many other places, Jamaica. And then from the U.S., Reverend A. Walters. Alexander Walters actually becomes the president of the Pan-African Association, even though it was started by Williams. Williams was the secretary. Walters, who was also the head of the AME Zion Church. This is a little different than the AME Church, just a break off from the AME Church, the AME Zion Church, but just as important of an institution. He's there. Anna Julia Cooper, one of the most important thinkers at the time on the intersection. He didn't call it intersectionality, but it was intersectionality before intersectionality, because she talks about the double triple oppression faced by African women, as Black, and as working class people. So she was based out of DC, one of the great thinkers of the early 20th century, Anna Julia Cooper. Du Bois was there. You had some other sisters that were there that came as well. So it wasn't just Black men meeting up. You had sisters there. She's probably the most prominent one, Anna Julia Cooper. So you had these attendees there. Very important meeting in 1900. Williams would go from this meeting and he established this Pan-African Association. Then he would go across the world organizing it. He went back to the Caribbean, organized chapters of it. Then he went and moved to South Africa. Again, everybody's going to South Africa. He goes to South Africa and starts practicing law, as well as advocating for the rights of Africans in South Africa. So his travels took him. I just like to show this image to show how important it is to travel for these types of purposes. He went from Trinidad to the States, to Canada, to Europe, to South Africa, back to the Caribbean, and all over in just these 15 years between the 1890s and 1905. Williams would eventually pass away in 1911, and the Pan-African Congresses were picked up by Du Bois. So there wouldn't be another one until 1919, the year after World War I. Du Bois would hold it in Paris, because at the time there was a peace convention in Paris that a lot of folks were attending. And what Du Bois wanted, he wanted the first Pan-African Congress, you see the name change, it went from conference to Congress, to be a place where Africans can make their case. Because after World War I, Germany lost all of its colonies in Africa. And for Du Bois and the other Pan-Africanists, they saw this as an opportunity. They saw Europe being weak from its own tribalism, fighting, World War I. It wasn't even World War I. It was just called the Great War, because nobody thought there was going to be a sequel. They thought this was it. So Africans were watching this and they said, okay, Europe's weak. Let's make some inroads. Let's do some lobbying. Let's write letters to the British and the French and say, hey, why don't you let us administer to Germany's colonies and really make them a place where we can bring Africa up for development? And at the same time, we're going to be advocating for the rights of Black folks that are still underneath colonization. So 1919, you have the first Pan-African Congress. Then we have another one in 21, in 23, and in 27. And again, these congresses would get more and more African as the years went on, even though they weren't actually held in Africa. And these were the ones organized by Du Bois. So for a lot of folks, when they think about Pan-Africanism, they think about Du Bois because he was the main organizer of these congresses. In fact, a lot of people had lost Henry Sylvester Williams' name for a while because they became so much associated with Du Bois. But the other reason why these congresses were happening during these years in particular, there was another movement afoot that was attracting millions of African people. These congresses were very important, but they attracted more of the, I won't say elite, but the educated upper class, whatever, still committed to the race, but Black folks in Europe that were students and diplomats to some extent, people of the ilk of Du Bois. Whereas this man's movement is going to attract millions of everyday working class African people all over the world. And he was influenced not by Du Bois, but by Washington. And we're talking about Marcus Garvey. Let me introduce him and then we'll take a break. Born in St. Ann Bay, Jamaica in 1887. He grows up the son of a printer. He becomes a printer's assistant. He learns that trade. So he understands the importance of communication. Garvey eventually grows up in Jamaica, then he starts traveling throughout the Caribbean, working in different places, the Panama Canal Zone, Nicaragua, Central America. And he's observing how African people are being treated throughout the Caribbean, the exploitation that they face. He travels to London. While all he's doing this traveling, he learns about Booker T. Washington. You cannot learn. He's the most famous Black person in the world after Emperor Menelik II. So he writes to Washington and he starts a correspondence because it's his dream to open up a Tuskegee Institute in Jamaica. One of the most important things I always like to point out when we talk about this time period, All of these documents, these letters that these leaders are writing back and forth to each other, they're all still around. This is, and this is not on our course website, but this is a 12-volume book. This is volume 2 of 12 volumes. You see how thick this is. This book is about 660 pages. The Marcus Garvey and Unia papers. It was edited by historian Robert Hill. This is volume 2 of 12 volumes that are all this thick of correspondence and papers and speeches that give you the primary sources of this history. One of the documents in there is the letter from Booker T. Washington to Marcus Garvey, because Garvey had written Washington and Washington wrote him back. And the plan was for Garvey to come to the United States to meet with Booker T. Washington to talk about his plans. The problem is, in 1915, Booker T. Washington passes away before Garvey could actually meet him in person. But he was, the year before he was supposed to meet Washington in 1914, Marcus Garvey was in London, and he had also been mentored in London by another great Pan-African activist named Deuce Ali, who was an African that was from Egypt. His mother was from Sudan, but he had been living in London. He had worked as an actor, and he was also an activist. And he also mentored Garvey when Garvey was in London. But on his way back from London in 1914, he's on a steamship, and he enters a conversation with a brother from the West Indies. I'm not sure what country he was from, and his wife was from South Africa. And Garvey listened to this brother and the brother's wife talk about the conditions in South Africa. And he went back into his cabin in the ship, and he just thought all night, this has to stop. The oppression of African people has to stop, and I'm going to be the person to help put it to an end. So from that conversation, again, you see how the role South Africa plays. He decides he's going to start an organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Let's stop there, then I'll get back into Garvey, because I know there might be some questions. So Daniel, let me know what's in the chat. And if folks have questions, please raise your hand, and Daniel will unmute you, and we'll go from there. So Daniel, what you got for me?
So the only questions I see so far are about the slides. Some people are saying that they're having trouble seeing all the text. So they would like to know if it's possible to have the slides screen shared for future classes, and if the slides are uploaded to the course website.
We could do both. Okay, so I can upload them to the course website, and then maybe next week I'll share them with Daniel, and then we can have it shared. Yeah, we'll talk about that. We'll work something out with that. Yeah, definitely. What else? Anything else? Or was that just that was in? We got hands. Anybody raise their hand? Questions or comments?
I don't see any raised hands right now.
Okay, all right. If there's none, I'll give folks one more chance. Any questions? I'll keep going if not. All right, I'll keep going.
Clyde, can I ask a question? It's Jacqueline.
Yes.
All of this was happening, well, I was speaking about Benito Silva during he was in Ethiopia during the Battle of Adwa. Did he have any role to play in what Ethiopian did?
He came after the battle. He came because of the battle. Like he heard about it, heard about the victory, and then he went. So he was there the year after.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right. So let me go a little bit further in, and then we'll open it up again for questions. So Garvey establishes the UNI in 1914 in Jamaica with a handful of people, including Amy Ashwood Garvey, or at the time she was just Amy Ashwood, but she would become his first wife. He married two women named Amy, not at the same time. There's a whole discussion about that, and there's a whole conversation, but we won't get into it today. If you want to learn about it, it's in our Sheroes class. If you want to know about the relationship between the two Amys. But I do bring them up because this association would not have existed and would not have become the largest organization the African people ever had without both of these women and without the millions of African people that were in the organization, that committed to it, and that built it alongside of the vision of Marcus Garvey. So he builds it up in the U.S. In Jamaica. He wants to come to the U.S. to meet Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington passes away before he can meet, but he's in America. He establishes himself in Harlem, New York in 1916 and starts the UNIA there again. Now, let's look at the rise of this organization. Garvey's organization goes from being a handful of people in Jamaica in 1914 to by the time we get to the convention that we're going to talk about in 1920, he has 25,000 people in Madison Square Garden. That's 6 years. What between 1914 and 1920 allowed him to have this type of following? Garvey was an expert organizer. During his travels in the Caribbean, he had saw labor organizing. He knew what it meant to be a working class person. He had traveled all over the African world, not to Africa, but to meet up with Africans in Europe, Africans in the Caribbean, Africans in South America, and in the US. So he knew the power of organizing. The speeches that he would make were unlike what anybody else were hearing at the time. He was bold. He presented a vision of a liberated Africa. He encouraged people to be proud of their Africanness, because this is a time where people are starting to run away from it. People in the United States blacks in the United States are starting to, and in the Caribbean are starting to let that propaganda seep in that they're somehow different than Africans in the continent. You know, people are bleaching, straightening their hair. People are hating their African features. And here comes Marcus Garvey saying, no, God knew what he was doing when he made you black. Love your Africanness. You're the oldest people in the world. He would point to that same Ethiopian prophecy that we talked about last week. Princes shall come out of Egypt, and Ethiopia shall stretch forth their hands unto God. That was a constant in his speeches. So pride in Africa, pride in African culture, the self-help philosophy of Booker T. Washington. Do for self. These white folks aren't going to give you a job. Make your own job. These white folks are going to let you into politics. Make your own politics. And this got him in trouble with some of the black leaders, particularly in the U.S. Because Garvey was saying later for the U.S., Africa for the Africans, Europe for the Europeans, Asia for the Asians, Africa for the Africans. And a lot of people got this confused. They say, Marcus Garvey, you want us all to go back to Africa? And Garvey said this. He said, look, we don't need everybody to go back to Africa, but we do need Africa to be strong to protect the rights of African people all over the world. And he said, in fact, some of you are no good in America, you ain't gonna be any good in Africa. So I don't need all of you to go back. That's what he said. But he said, look at what's going on in the United States. This is 19 teens. This is after World War I. What happened? 1919 was the most violent year on record for black people in the United States. This is called the Red Summer. Lynchings were a pastime in the United States, where you had communities where white folks would kill a black person, usually a black man, but not always. Black women were lynched, black children were lynched. And they would have a picnic under the dead body, burn the body, mutilate it, sell the Sam Hose, who was lynched in Georgia. And Du Bois witnessed this, the after effects of this lynching and wrote about it. He was killed and they sold pieces of his body as souvenirs. You know, so Garvey's reflecting on this and he said, unlike Du Bois, and Du Bois had helped found the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, in 1909, which came out of the Niagara movement. And Du Bois is fighting for equal rights in the United States and voting rights for black folks and end to lynching. And Garvey is saying, look, you're not going to convince these people to treat you human. We need to have our own things, our own businesses, our own space, our own country, because we're never going to get justice here. No matter how much you advocate, no matter how much you do, no matter how many interracial organizations you create, These folks are not going to treat you like a human being. So stop appealing to them. And Garvey said, I'm going to go straight to the source. One of the things that Garvey got criticized for as he was developing the UNIA, Garvey goes and meets with the Ku Klux Klan. A lot of folks were like, why would he do that? Well, at the time, the Ku Klux Klan, particularly in the Midwest, they actually controlled state governments. They controlled the government in Indiana, in the state of Indiana. They controlled governments, the state governments in the South. So Garvey said, why would I talk to the government if I could just go straight to the source? And he said, if you want us out of this country and you want black folks, white folks to be separate, I do too. So I want black folks to be able to control their own communities. Just leave us alone and let us develop. Africa for the Africans, at home and abroad. So this message resonated with black folks. It resonated with the immigrants from the Caribbean that were in Harlem and in other places in Florida and the US. It resonated with Africans from the South who had migrated to the North, who had grown up under Booker T. Washington as the idol, and this idea of self-help and black people building their own institutions. It resonated with members of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. It resonated with so many working class black people that millions joined Garvey's organization because he presented them with this vision of being independent and strong. Not only that, Garvey's message would go throughout the Caribbean, South America, Australia even. There's an article about Garvey's impact on black organizing in Australia and in Africa. So by the time we get to 1920, 22 countries his organization is active in, 500 chapters, and ultimately at its height, 6 million members. And these images are from that 1920 convention. You see the Black Cross nurses here with the banner. You see the motorcade and the parade throughout New York. And I love the message on the car. You might not be able to see it, but it says, the new Negro has no fear. The new Negro has no fear. That's what it says on the car. And then you see the African Legion, these brothers in military uniform, there to protect black communities. So Garvey had nurses. He had the Black Cross nurses. He had the military wing, the African Legion. In fact, one of the speeches that really got him in trouble with the US government, he says, if they lynch a Negro in the South, we need to be able to push a button to lynch a white man in Africa. This is what he said. These sites, no black people hadn't seen anything like this before. Never had they seen black men standing and marching like this. The sisters having their place as nurses and auxiliary. They had things for children. They had all of these institutions that were being built that gave pride to black people. And all this culminated in the convention in 1920. The first international convention of the Negro peoples of the world, August 1st through August 3rd, 1920. You see some of the delegates. From this convention, we got a couple of things, important things to mention. One, the Declaration of the Rights of Negro Peoples of the World was presented at this convention. This was written by Garvey and other members of the UNIA. This was the black people's declaration of what their rights were going to be. And this is up on our course website if you can't see it. Also, the Ethiopian Anthem, written by Rabbi Arnold Ford and Burrell. This is not the entire song, but some of the lyrics. What's the first word in the Universal Ethiopian Anthem? Why do they call it Ethiopian Anthem? What we talked about last week, the importance of Ethiopia. Ethiopia, thou land of our fathers, thou land where the gods love to be. As storm cloud at night suddenly gathers, our armies come rushing to thee. We must in the fight be victorious when swords are thrust outward to gleam. For us will the victory be glorious when led by the red, black, and green. That's the other thing that came out of this convention. Whenever you see that red, black, and green flag, that's that Garvey Liberation flag. This is what's coming out of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. This newspaper The Negro World, which was edited by Garvey, by a number of different people. And Garvey wrote for it. It talked about events all over the African world. It brought Garvey's message all over the world. And included a section called What Our Women Think, which was edited by Amy Jacques Garvey, who married Garvey in 1922. He got divorced from Amy Ashwood, married Amy Jacques Garvey, but the work continues. Because of all of this work, Garvey actually gets locked up in 1923 by the US government. We'll talk about that in a second. But anyway, some of the other important organizers in Garvey's global movement, you got Earl and Louise Little. Louise Langdon was her maiden name, but they meet in the Garvey movement. Louise Langdon from Grenada, Earl Little from Georgia, they actually meet in Montreal. And in a lot of our classes, I talk about this because it's very important. They meet in Montreal. They have a son in 1925 named Malcolm Little, who becomes Malcolm X. So we see all the connections. But they were both organizers in Garvey's movement. In fact, Louise Little was a writer for the Negro World, a reporter for the Negro World. And Earl Little set up chapters of Garvey's organization throughout the United States and was actually killed as a result of his activism for Garvey. This is one of Malcolm's first memories, is his father having their house burned down by the Klan in, it was either Nebraska or Michigan, for organizing for Garvey. So this is the far reach of the organization. But really, when we get back into it, and we look at Garvey and Garveyism in Africa, because of the event of 1920, the convention of 1920, and the Negro world, Garveyism spread a number of different ways. And eventually branches will be established in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Senegal, Nigeria, Namibia, South Africa, the Gold Coast, Cameroon, and Zambia, as well as there might have been others that we just don't have on record. Garvey's message spread because of African sailors and travelers that took that Negro world from the US to the Caribbean, to Europe, and then ultimately to Africa. Jomo Kenyatta writes in his book that in Kenya, a youth would be tasked with reading some of Garvey's message in the Negro world and then running that message to different villages in Kenya. This is how far-reaching his message went. So the seamen would smuggle the Negro world into Africa because eventually all the colonizers, the British, the French, the Americans, the Dutch, the Portuguese, all of them tried to ban Marcus Garvey. This is how much this one Jamaican man was feared all over the world. In Trinidad, they wanted to ban Garvey. Back home in Jamaica, they wanted to ban the Negro world as much as they could. Throughout the United States, he was on the radar. And then, of course, in Africa, where he's talking about Africa for the Africans, we can read one of my colleagues, Adam Ewing, is a Garvey scholar. He works with, he's in the Department of African American Studies at Virginia Commonwealth University, one of the universities I teach at. He writes about this, how the colonial record is filled with British officials in Nigeria and British officials in South Africa and French officials in Senegal and Belgian officials in the Congo, all writing about we need to keep Garvey out of Africa. Not just Garvey the man, but Garvey the ideas. This Negro world is spreading. It's going to cause problems for us. We're going to confiscate any copies that we get. We're going to fine and imprison people if we find you with the Negro world in your possession. We talked in our last class about how Nnamdi Azikiwe in Nigeria runs into, when he was a student in the 1920s, one of his classmates had an old tattered copy of the Negro world, and he kept it almost like he was hiding drugs or something like that in his room, because he said if he was found with this, he could be in trouble. So it appealed to Black people because, like, what's in this document that the colonizers don't want us to see? You know, you tell somebody they can't have something, that makes them want it even more. So Black people were encouraged by the Negro world. They wanted to read it. They wanted to hear what Garvey's message was. And the Negro world had correspondence all over the world. So it wasn't just a newspaper where it's just Garvey writing. They had reports about what was going on in Jamaica, the workers' strike in Trinidad, what was going on with blacks in Guyana, blacks in Montreal, blacks in London, what was going on in South Africa, what was going on in Kenya, what were about the resistance that was happening in the Congo. All of this stuff was being reported in one place. Because of this, rumors began to spread all over the continent, particularly after that convention in New York. Because you got to remember, New York is one of the major metropolitan areas of the world. So for a black man to have an audience at the old Madison Square Garden of 25,000 people, and then have this parade, and you see the images from this parade, and all these images were in the Negro world. A rumor started to spread in West Africa, in South Africa, and in East Africa, and in Central Africa, that there was some African American, because they didn't know he was from Jamaica, named Garvey, that had an army, and he was going to come and liberate Africa. This was the rumor. So it spread even further than where the actual branches of the UNIA were. And again, Adam Ewing writes a lot about this, and I put chapters of his book and articles up on our course website. The Grand General Garvey and his Grand Army are coming to Africa to liberate it. So the colonial authorities are hearing this rumor, and they're like, they know it that not necessarily be true, but the fact that it's giving so much encouragement to African people all over the continent was a concern for them. Because of this and all the collaboration, and we have another class that we taught not this September that passed, but the previous September. We did a seminar on snitches and sellouts. And there's a whole course session on James Wormley, who was the first black man ever hired by the FBI. And his job was to infiltrate the Garvey organization. He was one of many infiltrators of the Garvey organization. And in 1923, Garvey gets arrested for mail fraud because they say he was defrauding people by selling stock in the Black Star Line. But he wasn't defrauding people. It was there were some unscrupulous people in his organization, as well as FBI infiltrators that tried to destroy from the inside out. But even still, Garvey's locked up from 1923 to 1927, and then ultimately deported from the United States. The organization continued to thrive because his wife, Amy Jacques Garvey, took over. And you had other organizers that were able to keep the organization afloat. It wasn't really until Garvey's death that the organization kind of went. It never completely disappeared. The UNIA is still around today. It's not a million strong. But the impact of Garveyism, there hasn't been anything in the period of the African Renaissance, from 1896 to the present, that comes close into its impact on the African world as Garveyism. And not just Marcus Garvey the man, but the idea of African people coming together and being strong and liberating Africa. So this is how important this was. Let me just show one example, then we'll call it a day to kind of bring it all back home. One of the main places where Garveyism, the idea of Garvey and his grand army of his coming back to Africa to liberate, was really in the Congo, in the Belgian Congo. And one of the people that folks say may have been influenced by Garvey was Simon Kimbango, the prophet of a version of African Christianity in the Congo. Remember, we talked about all the atrocities that were going on in the Congo. This was one of the responses to it. Simon Kimbango had the same, almost one of the same type of historical trajectory as some of these other African religious leaders that we talked about last week. He educated in the mission school, faced the discrimination of some of the mission. I think it was the Baptists, I think, were the mission that he was educated under. And he goes to Leopoldville, which is now Kinshasa, and he hears about Garvey from a group of Congolese activists who were sharing the Negro world and Garvey's information. So that was one of the influences, but really it was Simon Kimbango's own spirituality that combined Christianity with Congo traditional philosophy, and he used it to create a movement in the Congo, a religious movement that he wasn't attempting to necessarily be in direct conflict with the colonizer, but he did want to give pride to the Congolese and a new spiritual fortitude. He performed miracles of healing, reported to bring people back from either death or close to death, healed people from their sickness. He preached about the restoration of the Congo kingdom and an end to colonial rule. So he wasn't for direct confrontation, but he said he's prophesizing colonization will end at some point. He taught that God was black. The same thing that Garvey taught. You got to see God through your own spectacles. If white men see God as white, you as a black person have to see God as black. It doesn't make sense for you to worship a God that doesn't look like you. He drew massive crowds for his movement and his preaching and his revivals. And of course, the Belgians were threatened by this, so they actually arrested him. He only was active for a few years before he was actually incarcerated. But even when he was locked up, people still continued to preach his message. And his churches, his sons and his grandsons eventually took over after he passed away, continued. And Kimbangoism is still one of the largest African churches in the world. You could go to Congo, throughout Central Africa today, and go to these churches with this liberation message. So this is one of the seeds. I'm not saying that Garvey was the only influence on Simon Kimbango, but we can definitely see that it was one of the influences. This is just one. And then next week, we'll get into the other influences of Garvey, because we're going to talk about the New Negro movement and the Negritude movement. The other chant from this period, I forgot, I wanted to mention this, that the followers of Simon Kimbango would say, our leaders, our young men, our young women, our children are lost. Our country is lost, for the whites possess it. But we teach that our land will be reborn. The whites will be driven out, and we will go into the forest. We will gather all the firewood, and we will place all the white people in it so that they can burn, and we will be the masters of our country. This is the stuff that the Belgians said, no, we can't have, we got to arrest us. But they thought if we just arrest the man, this stuff will go away. But it didn't. The people in the Congo continued to resist until in 1960, Congo got independence. But the problem is, you got some we'll get into that when we talk about the Congo crisis in a couple of weeks. But all this to say, this is a type of energy that the seeds of Garveyism planted throughout the African world, from Australia to the Caribbean, to South America, particularly Brazil, North America, Africa itself. These are what the fruits of the seeds of Garveyism. Know this movement, know the importance of it. And we'll stop there today with that. And I always like to bring this up because 1930, going back to Ethiopia, Garvey had said before 1930, he said, look to Africa when a black king shall be crowned, for the day of deliverance is at hand. And in 1930, Rastafari Makonnen is crowned Haile Selassie I in Ethiopia. And the footage of that coronation goes all over the African world. So just like Africans on the continent are hearing this rumor that General Garvey and his army is coming to liberate Africa, when Africans in the diaspora see Haile Selassie crowned Emperor of Ethiopia, some people take that as, this is our message that Africa is going to be redeemed, and this is our Redeemer. And you get a group of folks in Jamaica called Rastafarians, named after Rastafari Makonnen, that take that message and turn it into an entire theology. So you see this back and forth, and the importance of symbols and hope to African people, and how we can use these symbols to create liberatory frameworks. So with that said, next week, what we're going to pick up with, we're going to go from Garvey to the New Negro and Negritude movement. We're going to talk about that. What Garvey's influence had in the French-speaking African world, particularly in terms of artistic expression and philosophy, and how that was connected to the New Negro movement, which Garvey was also a part of. So we're going to go from today, we talked about roughly 1900 to around 1925. Next week, we're going to move from around 1925 to 1945. So that's where we'll go. Again, remember, you can join us here. We still got some seats available, so you can join us here in person, or you can continue to watch on Zoom. So does anybody have a question or comment that they don't mind being recorded? We can ask them, we can take a few of those, and then we can go to open discussion for about 15 minutes. So Daniel, any questions in the chat, or anybody have any questions that they want to raise their hand and ask?
Yes, I do see one question. Somebody said in previous classes, we've talked a lot about the dangers of centering African and Pan-African movements around any one person or character. Could you speak to the downsides that came with Garveyism, or was Garvey's popularity one of the few instances where the ideologies of one person worked without negative consequence?
No, that's a good point. During his time, I don't think it was a negative consequence. I think because he wasn't, no matter what his detractors said, he really wasn't an egoist. In fact, Garvey's problem was he was too trusting of people that he shouldn't have been trusting of. That was his issue. And it never was about, Garvey making money to live off the people. It was never what it was about. But the problem was, after he died, the UNI was so much associated with him that the next crop of leaders, for a number of different reasons, couldn't match that charisma. So there wasn't enough time to, because he died young. I mean, he died in 1940. He was only, somebody do that math, because my math isn't where it needs to be. Garvey was born in 1887, died in 1940. So how old would he have been when he passed? Is he even 50? He would have been 53. He's only 53 years old when he passed away. So relatively young, and left, young children too. One of Marcus Garvey's sons just passed away, I think, last year. But the problem was, because of his charisma, which was a blessing because it was able to unite millions of African people, when you don't have a succession plan, a good succession plan, you haven't trained people to take over, then it becomes a hindrance, and the organization never reached the heights that it did. There was also some infighting between people, but again, this comes when there's no succession. So in that sense, we can learn from that. We need to learn how to better harness charisma as African people, because it's important to get us started, but we need to get better at transitioning charisma to institutional leadership so that we can do things like the AME Church. Yeah, you had Richard Allen, but after Richard Allen was no longer the bishop and he died, you had other bishops that take over, and the institution continues to build and grow. So that's an important thing to point out. I'm glad somebody asked that. That's good. What other questions?
Robin, go ahead.
Yay. Good morning.
Morning.
Clyde. Is there, as far as you know, any equivalent or equivalence to the Negro world today? And if not, why do you think that is? Considering we live in a world that's so connected, we have online internet.
I think there are equivalents. They're just spread out, and I think it's different media. I think there's like YouTube channels like Black Power Media and even websites to some extent like Black Agenda Report, although I don't agree with everything that Black Agenda Report puts out, but they do a good job of getting that information out. But I don't think there's one centralized organ the way that the which is good because we have a number to choose from. But no, I don't think that there's one journal with quite the impact of the Negro world right now. But we should all be striving to create something like that. So maybe BI Media can end up becoming that for us in Ottawa. So yeah, I don't think it's one organ. I think it's a bunch of different ones, but they're out there, and that information is there. Like you said, we could find out things a lot quicker than they could back then. But we just got to have the will. We got the technology. We need to build up our will. Yeah, that's a good question. Other questions? And again, these are being recorded. And then after this question, we'll turn off the recording. Any questions or comments folks don't mind being recorded?
Yeah, I don't mind asking some questions. Clyde, this is Ken. How are you?
Good.
Good. All right. Thanks for the information. It's always good to go back and to reflect. You mentioned some key people who have been in the struggle Booker T. Washington, Garvey, Pan-Africanism, and some other individual, the work that they did. My question is, looking back at all the work that they did, and the fact that a lot of the movement that they started stirred a lot of excitement within the people, but over a period of time, they kind of fizzled away. What lessons can we learn from these individuals as we move forward in the 22nd century to continue move towards developing a community that is sustainable for people of African descent? When we look back at the work of Marcus Garvey and Booker T. Washington, what lesson can we learn, and how can we avoid some of the mistakes they may have made that caused the dwindling of their movement?
That's a good question. One thing I'll say, I don't like to present it as Garvey's organization may have dwindled, but his impact did not. And we're going to get into that more over the next weeks. Because when we look at Malcolm X, when you look at Kwame Nkrumah, when you look at George Padmore, Claudia Jones, and others, we can see that Garvey's ideas carried on, even if the organization may be far away. And I think that's an important thing for us to realize, or to talk about, is are all of our organizations, do they need to all last? What organizations need to carry on and stay as institutions, and what organizations are just for the particular time period that they're in? I think that's a question that we should consider. Lessons that we learn from them. The number one lesson is vision and commitment, and number two. Garvey and Booker T built institutions. Booker T built Tuskegee Institute, Garvey, and again, these men didn't do it alone, but they're the figureheads. They and the people that work with them built institutions with vision. They had an idea of seeing the world different than what it was. And they built these institutions to serve Black people. And they gave their life. Their commitment was funneled through those institutions. I think today, many of us don't have that type of commitment. We're committed to making the world better, but we're not race men and women the way that they were. Everything that these men and women at the time did was for the race, as they perceived it. It wasn't about, they were helping humanity, but that wasn't the primary goal. The primary goal was to help build Black people, which would ultimately lead to a better humanity. So I don't think a lot of us have that single-mindedness, that everything that we do, whatever our talents are, whatever our profession is, how can we use that to build Black people? I think we need to get back into that mindset. The second thing is we got to get to institution. We have to learn how to build. We're very good at critique, and a lot of the people that were against these men, and Du Bois built too, but other folks like him, William Monroe Trott and others, they were always critiquing Booker T and Garvey and others like that. Like, you should be doing this, you should be doing this. But what are you doing? We got a lot of people that critique now. We got a lot of people that get online or they write things about what activists or what institutions should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing. And at the same time, they're not doing anything but critiquing. It's easy to do that. It's hard to build. So we got to get back into that building framework. When you build, you're going to make mistakes. And we're not saying that people that build shouldn't be critiqued, but you shouldn't be critiquing if you're not building, because then you're just talking. I always liken it to, children playing with Legos. If I'm playing with Legos and I'm building something and you're sitting next to me and you're talking about what I'm building, but you're not building anything, what am I listening to you for? Build something. If you could do it better, and then show me the way. So we got to get back to that building mindset, and we got to get back to being committed to the development and uplift of our people, because that will ultimately uplift humanity. So that's what I think we can take from these seminal figures, definitely. All right, with that comment, we're going to turn off the recording and we'll start again next week. So please join us for week 3 next Saturday. All right.
Hey, Clyde, there is one more question.
Okay, we'll do it. We can ask her, but it just won't be recorded.
Okay. Mr. Francis, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Ken almost asked the question I had, but I will still make this contribution. The UNIA had a building in Toronto at the corner of College and Augusta Streets. And I'm sure most of you must have heard of Dudley Laws. He was a very good friend of mine. And he ran that building. He was a printer there. And because of the lack of support from the Black community, the UNIA organization was not able to continue making the mortgage payments, and the building went up for sale, and it was purchased by a Chinese consortium. And that bothered me for the longest while. The only building that we as Black people in Toronto had that we could call our own went to someone else, and so now we have nothing of that sort. It bothers me, and Ken always has the same question, the lack of commitment from the community. What do we do to encourage more active participation as these older pioneers did then?
We got to present a better vision. I don't think that we've done a good enough job clearly presenting a vision of what we want our community to look like, and then a plan about how to get there. We need both. The vision to inspire and then the plan to actually make it go through. And the problem that we've had over the past, at least from my opinion, we've had people that have been really good at giving people vision. I'm not going to name any names. We have people that are really good at giving people vision, but then either they don't have a plan or their plan from the beginning was just to rip people off. And a lot of our people have been burnt by things like that. And they are less likely to trust when the next project comes around, because they've been burnt so much by grafters grifters that present them with a vision and then take their money and don't have a plan. So we need both. We need to give the community something to look forward to, and then a plan to actualize it, and then be as transparent as possible as organizations, as institutions, and then be committed to seeing those things through. Because I lament that as well, that there's, even in Ottawa, I mean, there's very few places that we own and operate and control. This is why, and I'll repeat this again, I said it last week, I love being here at BIA Media. This building, not completely controlled, but this space that we're in, yes. And there is a plan in place to grow, to develop. So as you guys are on this call, and I never ask y'all, everything is free, everything that the course website, these classes, everything is free. But when you hear about Jaku Kampo, you hear about BIA Media, support, use the services. The Black Star tutoring from Jaku Kampo cost you a little money to get your kids tutored, but you don't pay that to somebody else. When you talk about BIA Media, watch the content that's coming out. Support it. Use it for your photo shoots. If you need headshots done, use the resources that we have here. Don't go outside the community. Now, we got to, and at the same time, our institutions got to do a better job serving. BIA Media is good. Some of our institutions, we want to go to them, but they don't act right with customer service. We got to get better with that too. We know that. But we got to have this reciprocal relationship to build each other up. We got to be committed to it. So, yeah, it's the same thing that I always say, that vision, the planning, and the discipline. We get those things together and we can turn it around. We will turn it around because we ain't been down that long. So I'm always optimistic about that. But thank you. And again, anybody ever has comments and questions like this, it always is a good thing to always bring up, to keep reminding ourselves why we do this and what we're actually trying to do. And we're using this history not just to repeat facts and names and figures, but to learn from it and to do better and to build. So we can always bring those comments and questions up. So the recording is off. Do we got any announcements? We got about 5 minutes left. Do we got any updates from the needs assessment folks? Anybody want to say anything? Because I always want to make time in case there's anything that folks want to bring up with that.
I have a quick question. Can you tell me how to access the previous lectures and this last week?
Okay, yeah. Daniel, do you have the course website up?
I think, yeah, I have it up. Let me get that.
If you could share that on your screen. All right, so if you go to the course website, and Daniel, if you have the link for the course website, put that in the chat as well. But you'll see all of the lectures there. I'm not sure, the one from last week, is that in last week's, go to the first module?
Yeah, it says April 30th, 2022. That's up.
Okay, so you'll see the links to the lectures there, the readings there that actually go back for about 3 years now. So that's all there, and all you need to do is register for the website. I mean, for the course website, it's free. For each course, you do have to register individually. So you do that, and then you'll have access to all of those.
Okay, so where it says register here in the chat, is that the link to the course website?
Yes, I believe so. Is that you put that in, right, Daniel?
I'm going to put that in right now.
Oh, somebody else may have put it in.
Okay, give me a second, I'll take a look at it.
All right. Any other questions? Anybody see anything else, or Daniel, you see anything in the chat, or anybody got their hand up?
Oh, yes. Robin has his hand up, and then Gina has her hand up.
Okay, let me go to Gina and then Robin.
Quick update on the needs assessment. So the terms of reference we need to build up for the committee. In a meeting yesterday to review it, so we're just making a few adjustments. A draft budget is underway. I know Jennifer is working on that. As we're planning, we met with India yesterday, and Elaine and Jackie Brown had gone through and put together a proposal so that we can apply for a grant. So that is also in draft right now, for us to finalize and so that we can get some funding to do the work. In terms of how the funding is going to be administered, so all it is itself an initiative that is, and I guess funding administration is done through not a subsidiary organization, but another organization, I think, Catholic Immigrants Center. So, and they have all of the infrastructure to support the funding administration. So if we get the grant, it's that's gonna go. Then there's a lot of work that is done. Another thing that we have to do is a project plan to make sure we actually get this off the ground successfully. So for those people who are here, who are part of the AC, we will need volunteers, and putting that code now to start to think about. And we talked about it in the committee meetings before, but I think it's going to be a lot of work. So if you are interested in supporting in terms of the form and assessment, that's part of that. Start to think about how if you are interested in committing the time and the effort. We're aiming for if I'm understanding for the end of August 20. So around that timeline, of course.
Okay.
Anything else?
I think you covered most of it.
All right.
The main, we need hands on the ground for this to work, and people, no matter what your skills are, I'm sure that we can apply it if you have a little bit of time.
All right. So please reach out if you can be of assistance, or if you know anybody that might. All right, Robin, last comment, and then we'll close out for the day.
Okay. Just responding to Ken's question about what lessons we learn. So one of the lessons learned is that we need to hold our community organizations accountable, meaning like ask really specific questions about what's going on. And this is coming out of directly now out of an experience that we've been having with a local organization who I've now confirmed and I have proof of is forging documents and doing all sorts of things, to get money that is not used to help Black people, it's used to help the leaders of the organization. So, and so we really need to hold our organizations accountable, and when people do that, we need to support them in doing it. So for example, like we're going to go very public with what we have found about this particular organization, and I know we're going to get attacked, but that's too bad. That's what we need to do, because the thing is that if we don't do that, these organizations end up wasting for like years of time, money, social capital, all sorts of things, right? Which is really harming the Black community, right? So we need to be able to basically take these organizations out way earlier, before they waste all this time and all that stuff they just mentioned. So there you go.
All right. So thank you for that, and look forward to seeing what comes of that. All right, everybody. For the sake of time, we do have to stop today. Come next week with your questions, comments. Again, we got a couple of spaces here. If you might want to come in person, you're welcome to do so. Just let me know during the week next week if folks are coming in. Is that a particular question in the chat? Daniel, what does that say? I can't see it. I just see something popped up.
No, there's no questions.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, thanks again to everybody. We'll talk soon. Check out the course website. And that's it for today.
Can I ask how many people were there today?
Just one, just two. My son and my wife. So please come if you want.
Thank you.
All right, everybody.
Welcome to BIA, Canada's top Black media provider. Whether you're looking for shows on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best content the Black community in Canada has to offer, and so much more. And better yet, do you have an idea for a project you'd like us to help you with? We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.